there'll be more change in education, in how we think about education and how we fund education in the next 5 years than there have been in the last 50.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us for our Back to School series. And just for context, if you don't know Mark somehow, Mark grew up in the Midwest. He graduated with a BS in computer science from UIUC, was the co-creator of the browser, co-founder of Netscape, Opsware, and now Andreessen Horowitz, which we're lucky to be backed by and to be working with them. And so today we're going to kind of jump into a conversation around education, the value of college, and especially sort of more practical recommendations for people faced with the decision of whether to go back or drop out or what in the light of COVID-19. So Mark, thank you again for joining us.
Good. No, it's great to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start off with an easy one. What's the purpose of college?
Well, there's the overt purpose of college, and then there's the actual purpose of college. So I mean, the overt purpose of college is fairly obvious. It's sort of this bundle of services. It's, the bundle basically is like, some level of sort of some level of actual education / skills training. We'll probably talk a lot about that today. And then it's, basically this kind of 4-year kind of, adventure for young adults, where they get to, in theory, socialize with their peers and so forth, form networks. And then it's, it's a dating service. It's a real life Tinder, experience, Tinder LARPing maybe. And then it's, and then it's a giant sports complex, generally attached to a hedge fund in the form of the endowment. So it's like some bundle of services. It's obviously the brand plays a big role. It's a credential. It's obviously a very important credential in today's society. That's the overt purpose. The sort of slightly more cynical view is that there's sort of an implicit purpose, which basically is it's basically the way employers delegate personality testing to somebody else, and basically so they basically don't get in trouble for it. So in the old days, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, employers used to actually do personality testing.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you applied for a job at Hewlett Packard as an example, or one of the big companies at the time, you would actually take like a battery of personality tests, and they would test your IQ, they test for intelligence, and then they would test for personality traits, and they'd be fundamentally trying to get to, in particular, they were trying to get to a personality trait called conscientiousness, which basically is sort of what it says, but it's basically like, it's the old thing. Are you a self-starter? Like, there's actually two sides to conscientiousness. There's what's called industriousness, which basically is energy, basically being self-propelled, and there's orderliness, which is basically attention to detail. So they're kind of trying to capture some set of both of those. It became some combination of kind of socially undesirable and illegal for employers to do those tests. And so basically the current theory kind of is that those have been outsourced to the colleges. And then so basically the implicit purpose of college, number one, is basically it's an IQ test on the way in the form of the SAT or the ACT. And then the other part is of college is what's called, they call it the sheepskin effect, which is basically the fact that you prove that you can actually finish the program.
Yep.
And that it's basically an applied test of conscientiousness, this personality trait called conscientiousness, which basically it's a predictive thing. If you can finish a 4-year college degree, it is believed by employers that is suggestive that you can also finish many other tasks, that you'll be a responsible worker. The reason we know that's the case is because of what's called the sheepskin effect, which is somebody who goes to college for 7 out of 8 semesters does not receive 7/8 of the income of somebody who goes for 8 out of 8 semesters. They receive half the income of somebody who goes for 8 out of 8. And so there's basically the sheepskin effect is either that last semester is responsible for a full half of the skills and education that you receive while you're in college, or the skills and education are somewhat beside the point. They're just trying to see whether you can get over that 4-year hurdle. And so the sheepskin effect is what psychologists refer to, or education experts kind of refer to as like, it's basically the proof that you were able to complete the program. And so anyway, then if you're an employer, this is why employers have indexed so much on college degrees over the last 30 or 40 years, is because it's the easy way to say, smart kid can finish his work, done.
So when should someone go to college?
Yeah, so I'm a believer, so I'm a pragmatist. We'll have, multiple, I think, parts of this conversation today, but I'm a pragmatist at heart. So my view is like you basically you have to, as at the individual level, you should take the system kind of as it's constructed. Like you shouldn't try to like fight to like basically overturn the system starting at age 18. Like you should get in a position of maybe power and authority before you do that. And so I'm a big believer. It's like the system as it is today. American employers are very, very heavily, and Western employers generally are very, very heavily focused on college graduates. In fact, one of the really weird things that's happened in the economy that probably is a bad thing, but it has happened, is that there's been a steady increase in the percentage of jobs that actually require bachelor's degrees, including for jobs where you would think it would, you wouldn't need that kind of requirement. But it's because of how the system is evolved, that's kind of where we are. And so I think it's actually quite dangerous to give somebody as an individual the advice, don't go to college. Like in the current system that we have, that's basically saying, don't prove that you're smart, don't prove that you're industrious and conscientious, and then basically be prepared to settle for fundamentally lower income for the rest of your life. And I think that's extremely dangerous advice. So the general advice is basically, if you can go to college, go to college. That said, I think it's worth being very aware, right, of basically what that actually means, right? And we already discussed, some of that in terms of like what you're actually proving. And so, for example, if you go to college, the general best advice is finish college, right? And as you know, like one of the things that we've kind of fetishized a little bit in Silicon Valley over the last 20 years is basically this idea that dropping out, right, is just
which I've been a benefit of, probably, to be very clear.
Yeah, that's right. And so basically, like it is true that like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and all these people dropped out of college. It's also true that that's very bad advice for most people. Most of us, it turns out, aren't Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg. And so, like, generally speaking, go to college, finish college. That said, be aware of what's happening. And then the other thing, which hopefully we'll talk about at length, but like we sort of have this tendency in the public discussion on college to talk about like going to college, and we're already doing that. But it's like, okay, there's two big loaded kind of dependencies in there, which is one is which school, right, matters like enormously, and then the other is which major, which matters enormously. And I think you want to kind of think about like a 2x2 matrix of majors and schools, and the outcomes are wildly different depending on where you land in that matrix. And I think basically, so basically, I think people focus way too much on whether to go to college. They don't spend nearly enough time focusing on what school and what major. And so basically, and here's where things get like super interesting. So basically what you see is that for the sort of hard disciplines of like engineering and math, it actually turns out there's a fairly flat distribution of income by rank of college. And so generally speaking, if you go get like a electrical engineering degree or a CS degree or a math degree, and then you look at kind of earnings over time, there, you do somewhat better if you go to a school that's kind of high up the rankings, but you do fundamentally more or less the same over time across all the schools, which is like an engineering degree is an engineering degree. And like electrical engineers or computer scientists or programmers or whatever, to the extent that they're kind of always in demand, like there's a market clearing wage for that skill set. And it kind of doesn't matter as much. Now, there are certain employers where they like will only hire people out of certain top engineering programs, but like most employers across the economy hire out of a very broad range of schools. And so like, anyway, so those are like the hard disciplines. We can talk more about that. Then there's sort of the soft disciplines, and this is sort of, kind of liberal arts, humanities, kind of all of the, kind of all, sort of, I'm going to say BA versus BS, right? So the BS degrees are like the hard degrees, the hard science and math and engineering degrees. The BA degrees, Bachelor of Arts, are usually the softer, sociology or English lit or, philosophy or, a lot of these, kind of humanities, liberal arts kinds of things. For those, there is a dramatic curve, which is you get paid much more with those degrees coming out of a top school than you do coming out of the average school or a lower ranked school. To the point where you really kind of got to ask the question, like, is a sociology degree from like, from the lower 2/3 of colleges, like, at this point, is it actually worth anything? And the answer there might actually well be, it may not be worth anything. Like there may just simply not be jobs for those people who have that degree from those schools. And the conventional explanation for that, people could have different theories on this. The conventional explanation the education experts kind of believe is that basically for the soft degrees, like for the hard degrees, there's definitely a skill. Like, can you design a circuit or not? Can you solve an equation or not? Can you write a computer program or not? For the kind of soft degrees, liberal arts, humanities, everything's a little bit, more open interpretation. Like good essay versus bad essay kind of thing is a little bit more in the eye of the beholder. And so basically the theory is that if you get one of those degrees from a top school, you also get the network.
So from an investment standpoint, if you're looking for ROI, you should, at any school, it sounds like, hard sciences, you're saying, good investment, sort of softer sciences or humanities, a bad investment unless you're going to a top tier school.
Well, yeah. So yeah. I think that's right. And of course, this begs of. I can hear the howling kind of in the audience already on this topic. Like this begs the question, right? Of like, what is the purpose of a college education? I would just say this: where I come from, which is like rural Wisconsin, it was just sort of obvious. Which is the college. The entire point of a college education is the income that you make after you get the after you get the degree. And so I was, as a kid, like I was never confused about that, right? And the idea that there are all these intangible kind of things about like whatever social this and that and kind of the all the other I would say aspirationally, right, what the liberal arts people will say is it's about how to live a good life, and it's about how to have the right values, and it's about how to become like aware of the world and all these things. And again, I've tried not to take a position on that. You could believe either sides of that. And so maybe my point is like maybe there are non-economic reasons to get a liberal arts degree, and maybe there are non-economic reasons to get a liberal arts degree even at a college that's not top tier. However, even if you believe that, you should go into that eyes open of what the economic result of that is likely to be. And the economic result of a liberal arts degree from a lower end college is not likely to be what people think it is. And by the way, this factors then directly into the whole kind of concept of the student loan crisis, which is like a huge, basically the student loan crisis is basically a two-part crisis. But the part of it that's just like the most kind of honestly tragic is basically kids that realize too late that they're getting the wrong degrees and or from the wrong school, and then they just don't have the income to be able to service the degree. And I think in that case, like it's basically like that's the part of the college system that like honestly enrages me, because I think it's basically taking advantage of naive kids and naive parents who basically have been sold this concept that college is good, even when that's not always the case.
So if you were president of the United States, total control of Congress, I know, scary, but if you were and you could do anything to address student loan crisis, what would you do?
Yeah, so first I would resign instantly, which I think honestly would
that
be
was off the table.
the only responsible thing to do. Well, look, this is starting to, so there, I forget what it was. I think it's the governor of Kentucky, if I recall correctly. One of the governors a while ago came out, because these are all, there's a big state level kind of component to this, because there are all these state colleges, universities that the state subsidizes, these states, subsidize. And so I forget, I think it was Kentucky, the governor of Kentucky, I think came out and basically said, like, we need to stop. Basically, it's time for these state schools to stop teaching like liberal arts. Like, it's just not an economically like valid proposition, because like the degrees aren't worth as much. And of course that generated, I don't know if that he's followed through on that, because that generated huge controversy, because people hate to hear that. But look, at some point at some point you have to have a question about value given, value received. In particular, look, I think people should be able to buy and pay for anything that they want. Like, people want to go get whatever degree they want and they want to pay for it, I'm all in favor. But like, we do have this like federal loan program that is just basically is this monotonically increasing pile of debt. And by the way, like the student loan program is like, it's basically this load, right, of like trillions of dollars of debt on the American taxpayer. And so there's like one question there. And then there's the other like impact on the students themselves, which is like student loan debt, at least today, student loan debt is the one form of debt that you can't discharge through personal bankruptcy, right? And so these students aren't just basically getting victimized on behalf of society; they're also getting victimized like personally. And it's like causing big especially this newer generation last 20 years. Like there's a lot of kids running around like they've been very damaged by this. And so I think fundamentally, like I think there has to be at some point the honest discussion about value given, value received, and then the other side of it, which we might talk about, the other side of it is there has to be some examination into how we got a system that ended up with this kind of adverse outcome. And I think I know why that is, which is it's a cartel. It's a government kind of sponsored cartel, and I think cartels are bad, and I think we need to kind of fundamentally reconsider the system. But
you can't just drop that without going into that. So what do you mean it's a cartel?
So viewed through an economic lens, so K through 12 in the U.S., right, is a monopoly, right? And it's just a flat out government monopoly. It exhibits all of the
public school, and they have no option. It's compulsory education.
It's literally compulsory. It's a captive audience. It's compulsory education. It's basically state. It's directly state funded. It's state run. These are government institutions. These are government schools. It shouldn't be called public schools. It should be called government schools, which is what they are, right? And so it's the government running a school, just like the government would be running a restaurant, right? The question I always want to ask on these things is, how would you feel about eating government sushi? Right. And then, equivalently, how would you feel about, how would you feel if the Department of Transportation started making cars?
Okay.
Right. Would you want to drive the official U.S. government DOT designed and manufactured automobile? Like, is that an attractive Do you think that would be a safe thing to do on the freeway? Right. The DMV, think about the DMV designing cars. Right. And so like, basically we have decided that like, we don't let the government, make sushi, and we don't let the government make cars, but we let the government make schools. And we expect that we're going to get better results. And of course we don't get better results, because of course we don't. And the reason we don't is because it's a monopoly. right? And the motto of any monopoly, right? The motto of any monopoly is we don't care because we don't have to, right? Like it just like the needs of the customers like don't matter at all to the monopoly. That's the whole problem with monopoly. And so K through 12 is a monopoly. It exhibits all those characteristics.
And just to pause for a moment before we go on to non-K through 12,
sure.
What data would you point to that says that, because a lot of listeners are probably going, okay, well, I actually had a great K through 12 experience. What data would you point to that says, okay, K through 12 doesn't work?
Oh yeah, well, it's just spiraling prices, so the great myth is that we've somehow slashed the funding for public education in the US over the last 40 years. Like that's just like false. We've like greatly expanded it. And so like the load per student, the dollars per student in real economic terms in the last like 40 years, it's something like tripled in the US. And the results haven't moved at all. Like they're just flat, right? And so massive price increase, no quality increase, like monopoly, right? Like, yes, like that's what you get. If somebody had a monopoly on cheese, that's the same thing you would get. You would get the same cheese every year and it would cost more every year, right? And so it's the exact same thing. Now, and look, if it is where you say like people should get what they want. If people are happy with the result, then, you know, fair enough. Like if people are fine with this level of quality, then fair enough. And if they're fine paying more every year, fair enough. If they're fine having, you know, their taxes go up consequently, like, you know, fair enough. But like that is the result of a monopoly, is that that's the case. For colleges, it's different. It's not, you know, the government doesn't actually own or run the colleges, but it's a cartel. It's an oligopoly is the technical term. When you think about it, it's a cartel, and it's a government orchestrated and blessed and sponsored and funded cartel. And this is really important. So there's four basically streams of money effectively that end up going to the universities that are in the cartel. All the current universities. So the state universities get like direct funding, right, from the states. But then there's the other funding to the state institutions. Then there's the funding to the so-called private institutions. There's air quotes for those of you listening on a podcast version. And it's basically, number one, it's the student loan subsidies, right? And so none of these institutions would be viable, right, if they had to provide their own financing, which is why that you've got this massive federal student loan program. And access to the federal student loan is based on accreditation, and the accreditation is run by the government. It's enforced by the government. And so it's basically like the challenge, the thought experiment would be try to start a new college today in the US and try to get it accredited to be able to get access to the federal student loan program. And like I haven't tried to do that. I don't know, you know, let's say the odds of success in that are quite low because the existing universities would view that as new competition and they try to kill it. They try to make sure it couldn't get access to federal funding. That's one. Second is there's all the federal research funding, right? And so for all these schools that do like science and engineering, there's always two sides. There's the teaching side and there's the research side, right? And so there's all the federal research funding, and again, that's a cartel. And then there's
people in the government are only going to give grants to people that they know or programs they know.
Well, they're either only going to do that because like that's sort of the reinforcing loop, and there's like a revolving door of kind of who runs these programs. Also, we could talk about, it's kind of the standard form of kind of implicit corruption that happens with these kinds of systems. But then there's also like, I don't actually even know the details, but like, can you actually get research funding if you're not an accredited institution? Like, can the NSF actually issue the grant? And I don't know whether that's the case or not, but I wouldn't be shocked if they literally can't do it, or if a bunch of people all of a sudden try to get access to that grant money, that they would put that rule in place. And so it's basically, I mean, look, here's the thought experiment. Like what was the last major new research university that was created in the United States?
Not sure. Yeah. Nobody
knows because it's been so long, right? Like it's been, I don't know. Like I actually honestly don't know. It might be Stanford. Like if Stanford was 1890, like has there been one since 1890? Like, I don't know. And so like that just kind of tells you like the market, it's not a properly functioning market. Like if hasn't been a new entrant in 100 years, like the market's not functioning properly. I mean, even in the car industry, we have Tesla, right? Like, you know, like, come on, it's like at some point, come on, like somebody's, and look, people have tried this, but like it's an indicative of how hard it is to do it, that they haven't been kind of clear enough.
Student loans and then research funding.
Student loans, research funding, and then there's two forms of tax breaks that these institutions are all allowed to run as nonprofits. Which is a very specific kind of blessing that the government gives them. And there's two forms of tax breaks. There's tax breaks that are allowed to run nonprofit at the operating level, and they're allowed to run their endowments, invest them on a nonprofit basis. And so they not only do not have to pay taxes on their actual operating income, they also don't have to pay taxes on their investment income. And again, like try to get a new university in place and not only get access to the first two that we talked about, but also get access to these tax breaks as a nonprofit. And by the way, you just go to these universities now, like, these are big businesses, right? These are like, you know, they run these like giant sports programs, right? That like have like, you know, national audiences. They run these giant endowments, you know, that have, you know, some of these endowments are now $30, $40 billion big, right? These are like, huge hedge funds. There's all these programs. There's like, steadily rising, kind of compensation to administration. There's, all these things. And so like they have many of the hallmarks of a for-profit business. They just don't get taxed like one.
Yep.
And so anyway, so it's just, and so basically, and then it's the accreditation cartel that kind of reinforces all that. And so it has all of the same basic characteristics that you would expect. It's a slightly less worse form of a monopoly.
So basically, K-12 monopoly, college system is an oligopoly that is jockeying for position, trying to increase status and rank. And then would you say that's like the pure explanation for why price outpaces inflation?
Yeah. So this is exactly. So this then is the form. So basically, there's a very clear formula for basically skyrocketing prices, right?
Okay.
And just to kind of put the issue on the table, on the track that we're on right now, the price of a 4-year college degree in the United States is on its way to $1 million, right? At the top institution, $1 million. Well, at the top institutions, it's already cleared $250,000, right? It's already over 250,000, right? And it's, as you're pointing, like it's escalating much faster than inflation. It's escalating extremely rapidly, and so like you just all you just need to do, we could link to some of the charts, but like you just project out the chart. It's just this linear rise in prices over time, far faster than inflation. You just like write it, and you can just kind of pick the year when it crosses over $1 million. And so on the one hand, 4-year college degree is going to cost $1 million. On the other hand, a 100-inch flat screen TV that you can watch Netflix and play video games on is dropping, and it will ultimately cost $100.
Wow.
Right. And so this is the very clear like compare and contrast, which is basically right. The colleges are like the ultimate basically monopoly oligopoly, as we discussed. Flat screen TVs are like the ultimate what they call perfect competition, right? There's just endless competition to drive down the price and increase the quality of those things. And so we're getting the exact results that we would expect from the systems that were built. We're just like really angry about it, right? Because like we think it's unfair and unjust, but like the system is running as designed in both directions. The economic system that we have is running as designed. Yeah. So then you basically say, well, okay, why on earth is this price just keeps skyrocketing? And it's basically supply meets demand, like any market. And basically, what the government does in education is just like what they do in healthcare, and it's just like what they do in housing. Is they basically have a 2-part strategy for managing these markets. They restrict supply, right? So the fact that you can't build, as we discussed, like you basically, practically speaking, can't build new colleges and universities in the same way anymore. And then subsidizing supply restricting supply causes prices to rise naturally, right? Because there's more kids that want to go to school than can get in, so prices rise. And then on the other side, because prices are rising, that creates political pressure, which they resolve by subsidizing demand, right, with taxpayer funding. And so which also causes prices to rise. And so what they're doing on the supply side is causing prices to rise, and what they're doing on the demand side is causing prices to rise. And so there's twin forces propelling prices to the moon. And there's no sign of anything that I can see anywhere in the system. I see nobody pushing back on this. I see nobody in a position of power and authority pushing back on this. So I expect it to continue indefinitely.
I'm very tempted to go into just very briefly the parallels to healthcare and housing, because that's kind of a new idea for me, that they are parallel to education. I know that they are in some places increasing also faster than inflation. But what do you mean in terms of government restricting supply and subsidizing demand for healthcare and for housing, just briefly?
Yeah. So for housing, it's basically the same thing. So for housing, it's and specifically, right, it's housing all the places where people really want to live, right? So this is not really an issue in like rural Wisconsin or like rural Arkansas or something. Like this is an issue in like San Francisco and New York and San Diego and Seattle and Austin and all the places where people all the places where there's like lots of economic opportunity. It's always the same housing policy, and the housing policy is don't build housing. Right. Like, again, it's basically these cities are like local monopolies. These cities are local monopolies over their own geography. They've got their local employers. And so their attitude towards, somebody who's moving there. Taxpayers. What's that?
And stakeholders in the form of taxpayers that.
Yeah. And then you've got this kind of warp in the market where basically the people who participate in local government are the retarees. And so you get there's kind of this very deep inherent conservatism to city governments, even in these very liberal cities. And so the result basically is that basically in these cities, they've largely outlawed the construction of new housing.
Yep.
There was just a great example of this. There's a guy named Robert Reich, who used to be the labor secretary under Bill Clinton, who's become this like firebrand liberal activist. He's like an AOC kind of type, and he's been like railing on the increased cost of housing, and kind of in public. And somebody just found, he lives in Berkeley, because of course he lives in Berkeley. Somebody just found a letter he and his wife wrote to the local planning commission, basically attempting to kill a new housing development down the street from his house on the grounds that it would ruin the historic character of his Berkeley neighborhood. Right, which is in a microcosm, basically the mechanism by which these companies, these cities are all basically not building new housing. They say things like we don't want to ruin the character. They say things like, this and that, construction and traffic and all this stuff. What they actually mean is like, this city is ours, and like we don't want more people to move here. And basically, and again, like it's not
that's government restricted supply.
Yeah, and so basically the government's basically, these city level governments basically just like, they don't permit new housing to get built. So just as an example, San Francisco is a city with a population just slightly under 1 million people. Annual budget, by the way, of $13 billion, which is amazing if you think about what you're getting for your money there. And then they authorize the average year about 6,000 new housing units total. Right. And so think about your company, or think about Figma, right, which is San Francisco based. Think about how many people you're hiring, and all of your peer companies are hiring, and all the big companies are hiring. And then think about the idea there's only 6,000 new housing units a year. Like it's like, what do you think is going to happen to prices, right?
Yep.
You go through the roof. And then, and again, because the price of housing rises so fast, because of the restricted supply, that creates pressure on the politicians, right, who need an answer to like, what is the government going to do about that? And so their answer is to subsidize demand. And that's in the form of all the federal mortgage programs, right? And then that ultimately, right, is what led to the 2008 financial crisis. And that continues, right? We continue to subsidize housing in the US. And so again, it's these twin forces both driving prices to the roof. And then the exact same thing is healthcare is the exact same system. And then here's the significance to this, which is just like, okay, think about for a second. It's like education, healthcare, housing. It's like, what do those things all have in common? Like it's like, why those three? Because if you look at like the chart of prices, like those three are like the three outliers. And actually it turns out those are the three indicators of a successful, thriving middle class.
Wow.
Right? What does it mean? Like, what's the difference in a country like the US between being middle class and lower class? The difference is I own a house, right, in a nice place, like in a nice neighborhood.
Yep.
Like I am able to send my kids to like good schools, both primary and secondary, and I'm able to I have health insurance. Like those are like the three markers of middle class success, and these are the three parts of the economy that the government has decided that we need to send prices to the moon.
Okay, so if I was listening to this in 2009 when I graduated from high school, my sort of reaction would be, screw this, I don't want to participate in the system. Sounds like your advice from earlier on was you might want to reconsider that.
You should definitely, as a newly minted high school graduate, you should definitely participate in this hopelessly corrupt system.
So, I mean, maybe this leads to COVID-19. How does COVID-19 change this? Is this the wrecking ball here?
Yeah, so COVID has a bunch of implications for this. So there's a meme that's been going around the internet that basically says, video streaming services, Netflix, $10 a month, Hulu, $5 a month, whatever, HBO Max, $20 a month, Harvard, $60,000 a year, right? And so there's this, the first thing is just like, okay, we're about to find, like, to the extent that colleges actually can't reopen in person, which I think is actually honestly the case for this year. Like a bunch of them are trying, but I think it's basically hopeless with what I'm seeing on the policy side, on the health side right now. Like we're about to find out, like this is a good test of, I mentioned earlier, like what are the potential sources of value of college? Like if the source of value of college is what you learn, then presumably it has the same value if it's being streamed over video, right? But because we have no reason to believe that that is the primary source of value, because of things like the sheepskin effect, like it now really raises the question of like, okay, is a video streaming service that costs $70,000, even if it has a Harvard name attached, right, or a Stanford name attached, like is that actually a thing, right? And so that's like a very big and important kind of stress point. There are two other really big and important, I would say, stress points on the system though that are surfacing really quickly, which is one is, these institutions are not designed to run for a year or multiple years with like no revenue. Like they just, even the ones with endowments are not designed to run that way. And most colleges and universities don't have big endowments. Most of them run on annual budgets, annual cash flow. And so how many colleges, there's whatever, 3,000 colleges, universities in the US, something, how many can survive with basically a year with no revenue or with like greatly diminished revenue? And like, we're about to find out. And I don't know the answer to that, but there are predictions that this puts as many as 2/3 of them in economic peril. Yeah. So there's an economist named Noah Smith, and he writes for Bloomberg, and he's an economist. He has been studying this. And if you check his Twitter feed and his Bloomberg writings, he's been looking at this in quite a bit of detail, and he's very concerned about it. So that's the best analysis I know. But like, there's quite a bit of concern. Also, Clay Christensen, who was the creator of the disruption theory, who passed away unfortunately recently, he wrote books and published a whole bunch of papers on what he viewed as sort of an impending storm in education. He unfortunately passed away kind of right before COVID, so we don't know what he would think today. But I think he was already bearish on the economic future of a lot of these institutions for all the reasons we've discussed. And I think if you were with us, if you read his work, you can kind of extrapolate forward. So So there's that, and then there's the overseas student aspect of this, which is like super interesting, right? Which is overseas students, and in particular, the students from places like China play a disproportionately important role in American colleges and universities because they pay full freight.
Yep.
They don't get all the federal student loan access, and they don't get all the scholarships. They pay full load, and the reason they pay full load is some combination of the value they want the degree, but also it's the way, if you're a rich Chinese parent, it's the way to get your kid a visa. You can basically buy a visa by sending them to an American college.
No, it's shut down.
Yeah, and if you like literally can't get here because travel is shut down, right? Like, and if there's been this,
or if you're a graduate student, you're being sent back.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. So there's been this big wrestling match. The Trump administration actually moved to prohibit overseas, basically students with these visas from actually staying in the U.S. if they weren't actually physically going to. And there was a huge fight over that. Universities objected and all that. And again, this is one of the political issues I won't take a stance on, but to the extent that foreign students can't physically be here to be on campus, it does raise the question of whether that they will continue to enroll in these programs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they of all people they are the presumably least likely to pay $70,000 for the video feed. I guess I put it that way.
Yep.
And they really were paying $70,000, like they were paying. And so if you look at the budgets of a lot of these colleges, like basically they're heavily dependent. They basically charge the foreign students full freight, and then they basically the domestic students are like the loss leader.
There's domestic and foreign subsidies is what you're saying.
Yeah, basically right. Yeah, exactly right, exactly. And so it's like if I'm an administrator at one of these universities right now, and if I'm looking at a year of no foreign students, and I'm looking at for a year of no physical campus, like I don't know. By the way, also no sports program, right? So this is what my old CFO used to call this the shake and bake. Like, this is one of those moments in which everything has been thrown up in the air, and I think it's really, really unclear where this all lands. Now, by the way, the most obvious thing that's going to happen is just like a massive federal bailout, right? And so the obvious thing is just like the government will just decide to bail out the entire system because that's what the government does, and of course the taxpayer will pay for it. And so maybe it will be okay in that sense, but again, like if there's like a massive federal bailout of all these colleges, it'll be like what happened with Wall Street in 2008. It'll cause people to ask this question of like, wait a minute, like what are we paying for? And so I think that these topics we will all get very dramatic over the next few years.
Would say that colleges are shutting down, people are not going as much. Do you see that basically making it so that degrees are equally valuable, more valuable, or less valuable in 10 years, 20 years?
So very unclear, right? Very unclear. Well, because there's several dimensions to that question. Like, one is just like, do you believe there is such a thing as an online degree? Like, look, there's been remote learning for a long time. Like, there have been extension programs, like night schools. And like those degrees have never been worth the same. And so is the video version worth the same? Like, I would say unknown, but like we're going to find out.
Yep.
Like it's like an X-ray kind of test being applied to the system to see what's actually there. In a way that I'm very excited about. Like I think we should find out, but like we might not like the answer. So I think there's that question. By the way, the other interesting thing is in parallel, basically the SAT, ACT, and GRE are all being ejected right now. Mm-hmm. They're all being basically pushed out of the system. And again, this is a political topic I won't take a view on for the purpose of this discussion, but like there's the view on the left that these standardized tests basically are biased and lead to sort of what they call disproportionate outcomes. And so to the extent that the theory that schools are an intelligence, that the admissions process is an intelligence test, to the extent that that is true, they're about to toss that out. Like they're just getting rid of that. Like, so the UC system has gotten rid of that. Harvard has now dropped the GRE entrance exam for their physics program, right? And so if they're not doing the GRE for the Harvard physics program, like it's going to be dumped across the board. And so like that's also happening in real time. Yep. To the extent that college admissions was an IQ test that employers were relying on, that signal is also being erased right now, is being deleted. And so we've got this kind of twin question kind of playing out in real time. In terms of like and by the way, let's like, what's the value? You think about it from the employer standpoint, like, does the fact that somebody sat in front of a video stream for 4 years actually validate that, like, their conscientiousnly? Like,
it seems pretty conscientious to me.
Well, it is, unless, I don't know, like, it takes like 20 minutes to write a script that like moves the mouse right on a Mac. So it like fakes the fact that you're sitting there paying attention. So like, was that actually the person, or was that, her Zoom background? Right? Like, that's not a question people have had to think about. And all of a sudden, like, it's a question. By the way, also the other fun thing is GPT-3. So there's been this, there's been a huge breakthrough this year in what's called natural language processing. And so there's this algorithm now called GPT-3 that basically will write. It can basically write your entrance essay for you. Yeah, no. So it's like, okay, what kind of world are we living in? Like, what kind of world are we living in if literally we're taking an educational format that was developed literally, like when universities were first created, like it's like, what, 800 years ago or something? 700, they were kind of standardized 500 years ago. I mean, the university format was standardized before the printing press, right? Like it was basically, it's based on like, I don't know, it's like the old monasteries or something, right? And so like the idea that there's like, you know, the guy at the front of the room with like the 20 students and like there's, you know, meeting in person and then talking and then the way that they do the tests and all that stuff, like, you know, in the new world, like, I mean, number one, would you ever build an education system today the same way with the technologies we have now? And obviously the answer is no. Like you wouldn't build anything the same way. You build everything differently. But then there's the like, okay, we're now going to try to transplant this 500-year-old model into these new technologies in a way where we're not even going to be sure if the people were actually sitting there, much less that they actually filled out the exam themselves or actually wrote the essay themselves. Like it's just increasingly going to provoke all these questions of like what the actual value is. And then aspirationally, you know, as a venture capitalist and an entrepreneur, like aspirationally, it means like this ought to be prime time for new models. And we maybe we'll talk about those, but like we are starting to see those emerge. We are starting to see alternatives emerge, and some of them are very promising. But like I would say, like we like to quote my partner and I like to quote Lenin as much as we can because we're of course staunch capitalists and we think it's funny. So Lenin once said about social change, he said, there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen.
I quote on Twitter, but I didn't know it was Lenin.
It was Lenin, yeah. And so this feels increasingly like there'll be more change in education, in how we think about education and how we fund education in the next 5 years than there have been in the last 50. And I think it's going to be very distressing, but I think it's also exciting. And I think this might be prime time for new approaches.
After decades or centuries of the same model perpetuating, we have a period of uncertainty and chaos for students that are looking at that and going, maybe I should take a break from college and try that gap year or try some break or something else, some working, for example. You know, what would you advise them with if they are not going to subscribe to the view of like, just stick with it and get that degree?
Yeah, so I was teasing Dylan in the run up to doing the session. There's this concept of gap year, and I was teasing Dylan that like where I come from, there is no such concept. And so I've always thought gap year is like this rich kid thing because like only rich kids can afford to take gap. Like the whole idea of a gap year. Oh, great, a year of vacation. Like boy, that sounds nice. A lot of
people use gap years to work too.
Okay, so then there's that. Yeah, maybe it's a process of you could argue there's a process of maturation, maybe, or yeah, maybe stockpiling money to be able to live on. And then of course, you know, there are countries like Israel where there's like mandatory military service, right? And so that's you kind of get a whatever it is 2-year gap year whether you want it or not, right? And arguably that's good, right? For a number of reasons, not least of which is maybe you're actually mature when you get into college. Maybe you actually get more out of college. Maybe you're 2 years older and maybe more disciplined and more motivated. You know, kind of having been in the real world for a while. And so, yeah, so I can see all those arguments. And then I think there's the very specific form of that argument, which is the one that you bring up, which is like, okay, if I'm not willing to pay the X $1,000 for the streaming service, like, okay, what should I do instead? And I think that is like, you know, obviously the purpose of this video, but also like an incredibly compelling and important question. So a couple things. So one is there are actually like new programs. And so the one, and I'm actually not an investor in it, but like the guy who runs it is a friend of mine. So there's Lambda. There's this thing called Lambda, which is basically like an entirely new way to basically get, it's essentially the equivalent of a computer science bachelor's degree in basically in a year with a different economic, with no loan. It's actually a free program. And then there's what's called an income share agreement. And so there's that program, which is well worth looking at. There's Udacity, which is a company that we're involved in that has sort of a nano credentialing approach where you can kind of pick up skills and there's credentials attached to them. And there's a bunch of employers that are very excited about those skills now. You know, there's Coursera, which is another company that's done a lot to push forward kind of online college education recently. And then there's all these existing kind of extension programs and night school programs and so forth that maybe all of a sudden are more relevant. There's kind of like all the new education methods. And so the thing to do might literally be to like do one of these other things instead. Yep. Right. And so basically like take the year and like, let's hypothetically, like, let's even say you're going to college for music or something like that. Maybe take the year and go take the Udacity or Coursera or Lambda thing and basically become a computer scientist in the next year. Right. And then basically and then go back to school, finish your music degree. And now you're a musician who also knows computers. There are those kinds of options. And then the other option is to actually build something. Right. Which is where Figma comes in. But the way to think about that, so take a brief digression on kind of how to think about that and then come back to this gap year idea. So basically, like one of the interesting things about the internet is basically, it turns out, one of the things that's becoming very clear is there are actually, as far as the internet is concerned, there are like actually two kinds of professions. There are the professions that have the characteristic we call you can show your work. Right. And so where I can, whatever it is that I do in my profession or in my field, I can actually show the results online in a way that's like very clear and compelling and like, sort of fully valid. And then there's the professions where like, I just can't, like, it just doesn't make sense. So like, and I would say like professions where it's hard to show your work, like heart surgeon is like a profession where it's hard to show your work, right? Like, maybe you could get permission from the patient with HIPAA and everything else to stream a video of heart surgery, but like, who can even evaluate that other than other heart surgeons? And I don't like, that's not really how heart surgeons advance their careers. And then I don't know, how would, somebody doing, there's lots and lots of fields. I won't pick on fields, but there's lots of fields that might be lower value, in which it's really hard to show the work, or it's harder to see the value.
Okay.
But then you have these fields, and computer science has kind of always been the leading one on this, I would say, or maybe like writing has been the main one, but now computer science more recently, which is like, this is the whole thing with like open source software, right? Like open source software, like you literally show your work, like you write software code, and then the software code actually goes on the internet and everybody can see it. Right. And then you have, as you know well, but there's this system called GitHub that a lot of people choose to use to kind of put their software. And then GitHub actually has like an internal ranking and rating system for software code and for programmers. And so you can actually build an actual professional reputation as a software developer on GitHub without ever actually being face to face with another human being. And so there are people all over the world today who are basically taking advantage of this, to be able to basically build these incredible track records as a software developer, make themselves more employable, right? Because the employers, and like my venture firm, like we recommend that our employers basically spend as much time on GitHub looking for good programmers as they do on LinkedIn, or as they do going to like, college fairs or whatever. And so it's like software development, you can show your work. Obviously, your creative writing, anything that involves, written expression, you can show your work. Increasingly, by the way, the performing arts, video, music, right, all these things, animation, you can show your work, basically for free, which didn't used to be the case. I mean, it used to be if you were like going to be a professional animator or something, you might make a short film in like, film school, but like you'd have to get that like short film put like on this like weird conference circuit and exhibited to, convention circuit, and it'd be exhibited to like 18 people, at like midnight or something. And now you can like put it on YouTube. And like, if it takes, all of a sudden you actually just like literally become like a star based on it. And then that has real professional credentials, kind of attached to it. And then there's everything like Figma gets. And then there's, I guess, sort of all aspects of design, right? And so basically all aspects of design, both the creative forms of design and then also the engineering forms of design.
Yep.
And so there's a real argument that this should be prime time for people who have the kinds of skills where they can show their work to basically buckle down and make something.
So take
right?
a year maybe and build your portfolio instead of sitting on Zoom classes, perhaps.
Yeah, and then basically, like in some fields of like design, it may be literally a portfolio. It may be literally the design portfolio, and then it may also be actually build a working product, right? So actually, like design and build a software application, like all the way to completion, right? Or by the way, or join a startup, right? The other way to do this is as a team. Join a startup or form a startup, right? And basically have like get together with like your four friends, or meet 4 people on the internet who are also interested in the same thing, or whatever, or through a Figma user group or something, and then all of a sudden you like have a joint project, and you're able to and you literally may never. The great thing about the internet, you may never meet, right? Like you may never physically meet, but it's actually feasible now to actually do the work, potentially all the way to completion, and then really show it off. And this is like an avenue for career success that just literally was like basically impossible, 20 years ago. It's actually interesting in the creative arts. I don't know if you know the story. This is actually South Park. This is actually the story of South Park. Okay. So South Park was the first viral internet video. This is actually a big. This is actually really funny. So Trey Stone and Matt Parker in 1993, and there was no video on the internet in 1993. It was like a brand new idea to do that. They were these, I don't know, whatever, art school kids or whatever. They got hired by an executive, a Hollywood executive, to make basically a funny and very dirty, basically Christmas card video. And literally using cardboard animation, and it was literally the characters from South Park, and it was just this like really filthy little cartoon, and it went like super viral on the internet in like 1993, and it was like another whatever, I don't know, it was like that was 10 years before YouTube, right? That they did this, but it went viral literally as a QuickTime download, and then literally based on that video, they got the contract to make South Park the TV show, which has now been on the air for like 20 years, and it made them gigantically successful. And so like they in a lot of ways were like the origin story for this kind of thing, and that's the kind of idea where it feels like we're still in the very front end of that. Well, it's like the best career advice in the world. Okay, so the best book on career advice that's ever been written is Steve Martin wrote his autobiography, and it's called Born Standing Up, he's basically said the entirety of all career advice that you can ever get basically distills down to one thing, which he says: be so good they can't ignore you. right? It's just like everything else washes out. It's just like the work is so good that like they can't resist. They have to hire you. They have to get you under contract. They have to, whatever it takes. And so that, you know, for people with talent, and there are a lot of people with talent in the world, you know, basically like show it off, like be so good they can't ignore you.
One thing that I hear from a lot of students who are considering taking some time away from college, whether it's working or building their portfolio or all these examples of work, you know, thinking about alternative approaches to education, is, okay, well, I don't love the idea of going on Zoom classes all day long, but I also don't love the idea, you know, unstructured time, because I'm not somebody that has a lot of structure to myself. I'm not very disciplined. And, you know, college is a way for me to surround myself with people that are inspiring me, that are encouraging me to progress in this way. As somebody who is like extremely intellectually curious, very disciplined about your time, what tips do you have for students around that topic?
Okay. So here's the big, there's actually been a breakthrough on this front. It's called Google Calendar. So we talked earlier about, this actually gets into psychology. This is very interesting. So there's this personality trait called conscientiousness. It has what are called two facets, which is there's industriousness, which is raw energy. And a lot of people have, you know, a lot of people, the kind of people you're talking about, a lot of people end up in college have a lot of industriousness. But then there's the other side of it, which is orderliness, right? Which is basically like, do you line up against basically it's like expectations, right? And so like, and literally it's orderliness is like, it's like a core part of your personality where it's like, do you make your own bed in the morning? Right? Do you like wash your dishes after you have a meal, right? Like, is your house like kept up? Is your lawn kept up? Is your car clean? Right? And like a lot of people, like, by the way, including me, like listening to, a lot of people listen to the video are like, oh shit, like, you know, my car's a mess, right? Like if your car's a mess, like you probably are like low orderliness, because it like, honestly, it doesn't take that much time to like keep your car neat, right? So it's like a basic, or your bedroom neat. So it's like it's a basic test. And so you've got a lot of people basically who are, for this question, you got a lot of people who are like, they're smart and they're creative, right? And they're actually industrious and they're ambitious and aggressive and they want to do things. But they're just not inherently all that orderly. And like you said, basically one of the things that college does is it basically opposes the structure. It basically can paper, and by the way, a job does this also, right? Jobs impose orderliness also, you know, with things like schedules and deadlines and things like that. And so, yeah, so there is this like fundamental challenge, which is now you're on your own. Like basically what basically is your proxy for whatever level of orderliness you don't naturally have, and most of us don't have enough. And by the way, I include myself. Like me without a calendar is a disaster. So like I include myself in this. And my car and bedroom, left to its own devices, are both just disasters also. So like I sympathize with this. And so it literally, the best advice I've ever gotten is it's literally Google Calendar. And so it's literally, you know, pick your choice, but like Google's a good one and it's free. And basically the best advice basically is schedule everything.
Yeah.
Right. And again, this is the part where everybody immediately starts howling because they're just like, oh my God, that's the opposite of how I want to live. But it actually turns out the answer is actually schedule everything. And here's the key is you start by scheduling all the stuff that you actually want to do. Right. So you start by scheduling your free time. Right. So it's like, I'm not going to work from whatever, like for me, it's like, I'm not going to work from like 7 to 11 at night. Okay. 7 to 11 at night are free time. Like that's just how they're scheduled. Right. But then I also schedule 11 p.m. bedtime. Right. Like, so that's like, you know, and then there's that. And then I schedule wake up time. And then I schedule if I'm going to work from like 8 to 5, I actually schedule what I'm going to do. And then by the way, I have a to-do list, but like generally the goal is keep things off the to-do list, put them on the schedule. Right. And so it's basically like get everything off that damn list, get it on the calendar in a slot. Right. And then basically it's like during the work day or the work period or whatever it is, just, you know, this is easier said than done, but like just do those things.
Yep.
But do those things knowing that will end at whatever time you choose to have it end. And then you will go get to do the other things that you want to do, spend time with friends or with your spouse, with a partner, go for a run, or, you know, watch TV or whatever. Like literally schedule, watch TV, right? Schedule, play video games. Right. And then look, this isn't like a silver bullet because like you still have the challenge of like adhering to the schedule.
Yep.
But I just find for me, the big breakthrough was like, it's a lot easier to like force myself through a lot of stuff I don't want to do if I know that there's a big block of time coming up down the road. That's like my reward for doing those things, which is like, I actually get to do what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's the best method anybody's found so far.
As we come to the end of this conversation, so I want to be respectful of your time. I'm curious, a lot of people that are watching this are likely entrepreneurs or people that want to be entrepreneurs, and they're likely wondering, okay, well, but will he put his money where his mouth is? Will Marc or Andreessen Horowitz, would they actually fund me if I, you know, end up dropping out or focusing for a year on a project and ends up going well, you know, by some definition, or it seems promising? Would me dropping out of college, would that be used, you know, would that be a reason why they wouldn't fund me? How do you think about that, or how would you respond?
Yeah, so I would say the good news on that is we don't really care. Like I can't even remember, I don't think we've ever had a discussion of did this person finish college? I don't think we've ever had a discussion about, there is some signal you do hear a lot. It's like, okay, like the people who went to the programs that are like unusually good, you know, the conversation we had earlier, like there are certain, for example, computer science programs that are just like outstanding and are known to be outstanding. And it's just clear in the data that they're outstanding. And so, you know, there is some edge. That is a case. There are cases where there is an edge to kids who've gone to certain schools for sure. But yeah, did you finish? Not necessarily. You know, did you? So that's the good news. That's not so much the factor. And by the way, the other thing, like we have no idea what anybody's SAT scores are. We have no idea what. I mean, I guess we do know what their GPA is, but actually, it's funny. We always worry about the kids with perfect GPAs as founders, because it's like, are they kind of too orderly? Like, are they too much rule followers, right? It's like on the one hand, they demonstrated that they're like really smart and really conscientious. On the other hand, it's like they demonstrated they love following rules, right? Because and it's like you really want your entrepreneurs you fund to be like rule followers. Like, is that a good idea as a venture capitalist? And so anyway, but like we never look at SAT scores or ACT or GRE or any of that. That's the good news. The bad news is we're looking at everything else, right? And the everything else is basically like what have you actually it is what have you actually done? It's like what reason do we have to believe that you actually have the skills and experiences and basically capacity to be able to do all the stuff that's going to be required to build a company. And the thing that we always point out, and this topic also gets kind of hotly contentious in a real hurry, but the thing we always point out is a lot of entrepreneurs, especially these days, venture capital has become this very kind of public concept. Like people used to not even really, I never even knew about it until I came to California. Like I never even heard of it until I moved to California, but now everybody knows about it. And so there's this view of like somehow the threshold of being like a successful entrepreneur is raising venture capital. I always point out, and you can talk to any, you're a great case study of this, but you can talk to any founder who's actually built a successful company. Raising venture is the easy part, right? Like the VCs are like sitting there, like we sit there every day, like waiting for like the next Mark Zuckerberg to show up. Like, what's that?
Your job to give out money.
The job, exactly right. It's the job to give out money. And like the big problem we have is we don't have enough people coming in who like have all the skills and attributes, to be able to build these companies. And so like we're in constant despair that there aren't enough people for us to fund who have those skills and attributes. The reason for that is because you raise the money from us, that only begins all the actual work, right? Because all the actual work is building an actual product that somebody will actually pay for, figuring out a way to actually sell it to them, actually collect the money, actually service the customers so that they actually have a good experience and that they're referenceable, actually tell their story so that anybody will even know that they exist, run a finance, function so that they don't like lose all the money, run a legal function so they don't get sued all the time, right? All the things involved, recruiting, like actually get anybody else to ever work with them, right? It's like a really like fundamental thing. And so the challenge we always have is trying to explain to, including to entrepreneurs we meet with, the challenge always is like, look, like, we love you, but like, honestly, like we just have not yet seen in you that you can do some set of those things. And of course, we can take flyers on some of those things, like some of the time, and nobody ever comes fully formed. But like, we can't just take like a raw flyer on anything. Now, that said, the number one thing that causes a first-time founder to get funded is a working product. Mm-hmm. Right. So the general rule of thumb is like, if you're just like a brand new kid in the industry and like you haven't built anything and you show up for venture funding, generally you're going to be very disappointed because like there's a million of you. Like, great, your mother loves you. Like, there's another 1,000 of you like right down the street. Like, I don't know what to do with this. But like, if you're a kid nobody's heard of and you show up with like Facebook.com and it's working, right? Like that's a thing, right? That's important. And so this is why I like the Steve Martin thing so much. Right? Be so good they can't ignore you. The way to be so good they can't ignore you for venture capital is come in with a working product.
You're an A16Z portfolio company listing, or you want to be an A16 portfolio company. Should you require a college degree when you hire somebody?
So that is a very rapidly changing topic for the reasons we've discussed. I think Google actually just dropped the requirement altogether for college degrees, and probably most of the other major employers are going to follow. That is a really good question. It begs the question of what was it good for in the first place? Right. And especially, like I said, once they finish dumping the SAT, ACT, like it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens to that part of the signal. If these, if people can't actually go to college, go to campus, it begs the question of what's going to happen to the conscientiousness metric. And then really the question is like on the other side, right? Is like, okay, like what then will employers actually be looking for, right? What is the thing that they'll be evaluating and judging? And we've talked about a lot of this, but I think it's going to be like, okay, alternate credentials. Like I think there's a real opportunity here. Obviously, as I said, Udacity is one of our companies in this we're very excited about, but there are others like Lambda. There will be new credentials that will be taken very seriously. Google, by the way, Google is also, I haven't seen the details. They've actually announced a certification program it's actually interesting. Google's been doing these math competitions forever as a sourcing mechanism. So they have these math and coding puzzles. And at least in theory, they'll hire the winners of those kind of essentially sight unseen, I think. And so the new version of that, they're kind of standardizing that. And so they've got this like coding credential. I saw something where it's like $300 or something. And if you can like basically pass this coding test, they'll basically consider it to be the same thing as a bachelor's degree in computer science. And so like they may, so in other words, like an employer creating their own credential is something that I think is going to happen. So new external credentials, new internal credentials. And then I think employers, like, as I said, we've been encouraging our companies to focus a lot on this show the work thing.
Yep.
And so like GitHub in particular, GitHub used to be one of our companies, now owned by Microsoft. GitHub in particular has become a major credential, independent of all the rest of this, for hiring software developers.
Your suggestion to an entrepreneur would be look for people that have a great, basically GitHub presence or portfolio versus people who necessarily went to like the most amazing school and finished.
Well, think about the pros and cons, right? Because the question is like, okay, for the show your work stuff, it's like, okay, that like presumably that actually is a good IQ test, right? Because like, basically people have to be smart to like write good code and have to do good design. So that's like, that probably has it embedded. Is there a conscientiousness test embedded in there? Maybe, right? Or maybe it's an artist who's just like really undisciplined, but got like one, had one really creative thing, and maybe they're going to be a great artist, but maybe you wouldn't want to actually have them work for you. So there's like you have to kind of probe in on like, okay, what actually do you know? That said, look, on GitHub, people are building real track records on conscientiousness. So, on GitHub, you can actually see like how much code they've made and over what period of time and how many check-ins. And it's like, it's like number of lines of code is not like the metric that we measure good software by, but like if somebody's checking in code every day for 5 years, right? Like, and it's code that is building like a successful project at scale, and you can kind of see the quality of the work. Like at that point, you've proven more than any college degree could possibly prove. Well, so I guess I'd say this. If you're specifically, this is a more specific form of the question, what should a software developer do? The question is, unquestionably, the answer is open source, right? Unquestionably, the answer is go basically create an open source project or go become a member of an existing open source project and make successful, high quality, sustained contributions to that project over time. And that's like that I think at this point, I think that's clearly a better credential than getting a computer science degree. And I've hired people like that myself. Like that makes tremendous sense. And of course, the great thing now, you can do that from all over the world. And so I think that's great. And then I'll defer to you on the design front. You probably know more than I do, but like I think a very similar phenomenon is starting to happen for sure. And there are designers who have gotten hired entirely on this basis who have done very well. Absolutely. Actually, you probably know this. Video games. There's this whole there's video games, and then there's this whole community of basically amateur game designers who what are called mods and levels, which are basically user generated, basically sort of expansion packs for these games. And actually, the game companies have been hiring more aggressively recently out of that modder community. And again, independent of any credential. So that's probably another great example.
So this conversation has been pretty wide-ranging. If you relieve a student listening that's either considering college or they're in college right now with a quick piece of advice, what would it be?
Yeah, look, I mean, if you're in college, like execute on the opportunity. So like, I mean, honestly, take the hardest course load you can, like, try to get a good GPA, but like basically try to get the skills, right? Try to get as many of the skills. By the way, cross-disciplinary we haven't talked about, but like, look, let's put it this way. If you're going against my advice of getting an English degree or something from a sub-tier college and getting saddled up with all this debt, like at least start taking coding classes, like start to layer in the skills and take full advantage of the opportunities. And so, yeah, maximize that. And then if you're looking for these alternate paths, and this is why I started with the recommendation that kids go to college, which is like, if you're taking these alternate paths, like just be very clear-eyed about what you're actually getting, right? Mm-hmm. So if, with these new credentials, with the work that you're going to do, like the kind of thing that you're going to work on, like, so for example, if I'm going to work on open source, would I be better off making minor contributions to 5 projects or like a major contribution to 1 project? Like make this is the second one, make a major contribution to 1 project, because that really demonstrates what the employers are looking for, and just be kind of put yourself in the mind of how somebody's going to be evaluating you 3 or 4 years down the road, and then basically apply against that.
Awesome. Marc, thank you so much. This has been a really fun conversation.
Good. Thank you, Dylan.
Thank you. Have a good one.